In the pre-dawn hours of June 5, 1944, as a relentless gale lashed the English coast, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, sat alone with a piece of paper. He was a man burdened by the weight of the free world, and on that slip of paper, he scrawled a short private note. It was not a grand pronouncement of victory. It was a press release, to be used only in the event of catastrophic failure. It read, "Our landings can have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based upon the best information available. The troops, the air and the navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone." He folded the note and tucked it into his wallet, a secret testament to the terrifying reality of the moment. The invasion of Normandy, the great crusade to liberate Europe, was not seen by its architects as a guaranteed triumph. It was a desperate gamble, a monumental roll of the dice where the stakes were civilization itself. Failure was not just a possibility. To the men who had spent years planning every conceivable detail, it felt like a probability, a hungry ghost haunting the entire enterprise. The plan was a masterpiece of human ingenuity, but it was also fragile, a delicate house of cards built to withstand a hurricane. And that hurricane was waiting just across the 20 miles of turbulent grey water that separated England from the shores of occupied France. Outside Eisenhower's quiet room, the largest military machine ever assembled was coiled and ready to strike. It was a force of almost unimaginable scale, a leviathan of steel and human will. More than 5,000 ships, from mighty battleships to humble landing craft, crowded the ports of southern England, forming a temporary floating city that stretched for miles. This was the greatest armada in history, a bridge of boats built to carry an army across the sea. In the skies, more than 11,000 aircraft were preparing to darken the clouds over Normandy, to drop bombs, to tow gliders, to ferry paratroopers deep into enemy territory. And waiting on those ships, in the cramped, pitching, seasick-inducing bellies of the landing craft, were 156,000 young men, Americans, British, Canadians, Poles, Free French, and more. They were the tip of the spear, the first wave destined to smash against Hitler's fortress Europe. For 4 long years, that fortress had seemed impregnable. It was a concept born of paranoia and engineering genius, a defensive line known as the Atlantic Wall. From the northern tip of Norway down to the Spanish border, the German war machine had poured hundreds of thousands of tons of concrete and steel into the coastline. It was a wicked tapestry of interlocking defenses, massive gun emplacements hidden in reinforced concrete casemates, their barrels capable of hurling shells the size of a small car miles out to sea. Tens of thousands of machine gun nests, pillboxes and mortar pits, all sited to create overlapping fields of fire, ensuring there would be no safe approach, no dead ground. The beaches themselves were seeded with death. Millions of mines, anti-tank, anti-personnel, lay buried just beneath the sand. Jagged, welded steel obstacles called Czech hedgehogs were designed to rip the bottoms out of landing craft. Angled wooden poles nicknamed Rommel's asparagus were tipped with mines waiting for the rising tide to turn the shallows into a death trap. This was not a passive defense. It was a killing machine, designed with brutal German efficiency for one purpose: to slaughter an invading army in the surf, to turn the beaches of Normandy into the world's largest and final graveyard for Allied hopes. The strategic imperative for the invasion was absolute. By the summer of 1944, the Second World War was entering its 5th agonizing year. On the vast Eastern Front, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany were locked in a titanic struggle of almost incomprehensible brutality, a war of attrition that was bleeding both nations white. Joseph Stalin had been pleading, demanding, that his Western allies open a true second front. Our landing in France was the only way to relieve the pressure on the Red Army, the only way to force Hitler to fight a major war on 2 sides, to squeeze the Third Reich into submission. The Allied bombing campaigns had crippled German industry, and the war in Italy was a slow, grinding slog up a difficult peninsula. But only a direct assault into the heart of German-occupied territory in northwestern Europe could deliver the decisive blow. The moment had to be now. The weather, the tides, the element of surprise, the sheer mass of men and material gathered in Britain, it was a combination of factors that couldn't be held in place for much longer. And so the grand strategic question of when and where to attack had been answered. But it was overshadowed by a far more complex and far more daunting series of questions, all revolving around a single, unglamorous word: logistics. It is a timeless military axiom that amateurs talk strategy, while professionals talk logistics. And the logistics of Operation Overlord were so complex, so vast, that they bordered on the impossible. The challenge was not simply to land 156,000 men on a hostile shore. The challenge was to keep them alive and to keep them fighting once they got there. An army, as the saying goes, marches on its stomach. But in modern warfare, it does so much more. It fights with bullets. It communicates with wire. It moves with gasoline. It heals with plasma. And it defends with steel. Every single soldier put ashore was a consumer in the most demanding supply chain ever conceived. He would need, on average, over 60 pounds of equipment just to step onto the beach. He would require a continuous resupply of ammunition, from the 8-round clips for his M1 Garand to the heavy shells for the artillery batteries that would support him. He would need food, compact high-calorie K rations. He would need fresh water, medical supplies, grenades, entrenching tools, radios, batteries, and 1,000 other items. Now, multiply that by 156,000, and that was just on day one. Planners had to calculate the needs not just for the first hours, but for the weeks and months that would follow as the army grew from a fragile beachhead into a force of over 1 million men. They calculated that within the first 3 weeks, the Allied forces would require more than 100,000 vehicles, from jeeps to massive 2.5-ton trucks to Sherman tanks. They would need millions of gallons of fuel to run them. They would need mountains of ammunition, food, and equipment, all delivered to the right place at the right time. The central, terrifying problem was that there was no port. The Germans knew that a modern mechanized army was utterly dependent on a deep-water harbor to unload supplies. The ports at Cherbourg and Le Havre were heavily defended, and the Allies knew they would be fought for to the last man and demolished before they could be captured. The invasion, therefore, had to happen on open beaches. The Allies would be attempting to supply the largest, most technologically advanced army in history over the sand under direct enemy fire. It was like trying to thread a needle in the middle of a fistfight. Every box of ammunition, every can of fuel, every stretcher would have to be loaded from a large ship onto a smaller landing craft, ferried through a gauntlet of artillery and machine gun fire, and manhandled ashore by exhausted, terrified soldiers. This was the great logistical paradox of D-Day. To secure the beachhead, you needed to land more fighting men. But every fighting man you landed created a greater demand for supplies. And every crate of supplies you landed required more men to unload it, more trucks to move it, and more fuel to run those trucks, creating an ever-spiraling cycle of need. A failure at any point in this fragile chain of delivery would not be an administrative inconvenience. It would mean immediate and catastrophic consequences on the front line. A machine gun crew running out of ammunition on Omaha Beach would be overrun in minutes. A tank battalion that ran out of fuel would become a collection of static steel coffins. A medical aid station that exhausted its supply of blood plasma and bandages would be forced to watch men bleed to death on the sand. The bravery of the soldier is the currency of battle, but it is logistics that puts that currency in his hands. Before a single shot could be fired in the battle for France, a different war had to be won. It was a war fought not with bayonets and bombs, but with slide rules, typewriters, and cargo manifests. It was a war of numbers, of timetables, of tonnage and throughput. It was a battle against physics, against weather, and against time itself. This is the story of that other war. The story of the impossible, intricate and utterly vital effort to build a lifeline of supply across the English Channel and to sustain an army under fire in the largest amphibious invasion the world has ever known. It is the story of the quartermasters, the engineers, the truck drivers, and the planners who made victory possible, long before the first boot ever touched the bloody sand. The fundamental equation was brutal in its simplicity. An army cannot fight without being supplied. and it cannot be supplied without a port. The German High Command knew this as an article of faith. They had spent 4 years fortifying every deep-water harbor on the French coast, from Brest to Cherbourg, turning them into fortresses they called Festungen. They knew that any Allied invasion force would be a tethered beast, tied to a captured port for its survival. Sever that tether, or prevent it from ever being established, and the beast would wither and die on the beaches. The Allied planners knew this too, and they had an answer so audacious, so utterly unprecedented, that it bordered on madness. If they could not capture a port, they would bring one with them. This was the genesis of Operation Mulberry. It was not merely a plan for an artificial harbor. It was a plan to build 2 of the largest ports in the world, from scratch on a hostile shore in the middle of a battle. The engineering challenges were staggering, operating at a scale that dwarfed any civilian project ever conceived. The first step was to tame the English Channel itself. To do this, a line of 60 old merchant ships and warships, the Gooseberries, were sailed across the channel under their own power, then systematically scuttled in precise lines 5 miles offshore to create an initial breakwater. These were the sacrificial lambs of the invasion, their steel hulls forming the first fragile shield against the waves. But this was only the beginning. The true heart of the Mulberry Harbour was the Phoenix caissons. These were not boats. They were concrete titans, hollow monoliths of reinforced concrete built in secret up and down the coast of Britain. The largest were over 200 feet long, 60 feet wide, and 60 feet high, displacing more than 6,000 tons. They were, in effect, floating 6-story buildings. Towed across the channel by powerful tugs, these concrete behemoths were maneuvered into a vast, curving line where naval crews would open seacocks and sink them to the seabed with pinpoint accuracy. 146 of these giants were built, forming a solid, 2-mile-long outer wall against the fury of the Atlantic. To supplement this, a line of floating steel breakwaters called bombardons, massive cross-shaped structures anchored to the seafloor, were positioned even further out, designed to absorb the first shock of the ocean swell. Inside this newly created lagoon of calm water, the miracle of logistics could begin. The problem of the Normandy tides, with a rise and fall of over 20 feet, was solved by the spud pierheads. These were floating platforms with 4 enormous steel legs, or spuds. Once a pierhead was in position, the legs were dropped down until they hit the seabed, and powerful jacks on the platform itself would then lift it clear of the water, keeping it at a constant height regardless of the tide. Connecting these pierheads to the shore was the job of the whale roadways. These were hundreds of 80-foot sections of floating steel causeway, supported by pontoon floats called beetles, cleverly articulated to flex and bend with the motion of the waves. 7 miles of this floating roadway snaked from the spud pier heads to the beaches, creating a constant, reliable highway for trucks to drive directly from the sand onto the pier and up to the waiting cargo ships. Parallel to this gargantuan effort was an equally ingenious, though less visible, solution to the Army's insatiable thirst for fuel. The standard 5-gallon jerrycan, while a brilliant piece of design, was a logistical nightmare at scale. An armored division could consume 800 tons of fuel, nearly 250,000 gallons, in a single day of heavy fighting. Transporting that volume in cans would require an endless parade of ships and trucks, each one a tempting target. The answer was codenamed Pluto, pipeline under the ocean. 2 different types of pipelines were developed. The first, known as Highs, was essentially a 3-inch wide armored underwater power cable, but with the copper core removed, creating a flexible, lead-sheathed pipe that could be spooled onto the decks of cable-laying ships. The second, Hamel, was a more rigid but equally revolutionary steel pipe, welded into immense lengths and wound onto colossal floating drums called conundrums. These were 90-foot-long, 60-foot diameter steel bobbins, which, when towed by a tug, would simply unspool the pipe onto the seabed. By August, these pipelines, stretching from the Isle of Wight to Cherbourg, were pumping over 1 million gallons of fuel a day directly into the heart of the Allied army in France, a hidden steel artery sustaining the advance. These engineering marvels were not built for their own sake. They existed to serve a brutal, unceasing calculus of consumption. Consider the simple act of eating. A combat soldier requires over 4,000 calories a day to function. For the initial assault force of 156,000 men, this translated to over 600 million calories daily, a demand met by tens of thousands of precisely packed K rations and C rations. This alone represented over 600 tons of food that had to be landed every single day just to maintain basic human function. Then came the machinery of war. The lifeblood of the infantry was the .30-06 Springfield cartridge, used by the M1 Garand rifle and the Browning automatic rifle. A single infantry division's unit of fire, a standard measure for a single day's combat, included over 1.5 million rounds of small arms ammunition. For artillery, a single 105mm howitzer battery might fire 500 rounds in a day, weighing 16 tons. Every vehicle that came ashore added to the demand. A Sherman M4 tank carried 90 gallons of gasoline, but its Wright Continental engine burned it at a rate of 2 gallons per mile off-road. Its 75mm main gun required ammunition weighing 20 pounds per round. A P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bomber, flying close air support from bases in England, consumed 100 gallons of high-octane aviation fuel every hour it was in the air. This entire ecosystem of consumption, from a single bullet to a 1,000-pound bomb, from a blood plasma pack to a spare truck tire, had to be quantified, catalogued, crated, loaded, shipped, and unloaded in a continuous, unbroken chain. The planners used a system called the division slice, which calculated not just the needs of a 15,000-man combat division, but all of its supporting elements, the engineers, the signal corps, the medics, the mechanics, totaling nearly 40,000 men. For every day the invasion continued, each division slice was projected to require 650 tons of supplies. By D+30, with over 1 million men ashore, the daily tonnage requirement would climb past 25,000 tons. To move men and materiel from the transport ships to the shore before the mulberries were complete, a whole new navy of specialized landing craft had been invented. But to breach Hitler's Atlantic Wall, a menagerie of bizarre specialized armored vehicles was created, known as Hobart's Funnies. There was the Churchill AVRA, an armored vehicle Royal Engineers, which replaced its main gun with a 290mm spigot mortar, the Flying Dustbin, that fired a 40-pound charge capable of demolishing concrete bunkers in a single blast. The Churchill Crocodile was a flamethrower tank, towing a 400-gallon armored trailer of fuel, capable of projecting a jet of liquid fire over 100 yards to incinerate enemy positions. To clear the millions of mines laid by the Germans, there was the Sherman Crab, a tank fitted with a large forward-mounted rotating drum, from which dozens of heavy chains flailed the ground, deliberately detonating mines in its path. And perhaps most daringly, the DD or duplex drive tank, a Sherman fitted with a waterproof canvas screen and propellers, allowing it to swim from a landing craft several miles offshore to the beach itself, providing its own fire support. Every one of these machines, every pipeline, every concrete caisson, was a physical manifestation of a calculation made months earlier in some dreary London office. They were the products of that other war, the war of slide rules and manifests. They were the hardware that would have to function flawlessly, under the most extreme pressure imaginable, to turn the abstract numbers of supply into the concrete reality of combat power on the bloody beaches of Normandy. But for the men huddled in the landing craft, churning through the cold grey waters of the English Channel, the war of slide rules was over. The abstract numbers were about to be tested against the concrete reality of German machine guns. The intricate, magnificent and impossibly complex plan, a masterpiece of human organization, was about to collide with the oldest and most unforgiving truth of warfare, that no plan survives contact with the enemy. For the individual soldier, the corporal from Kansas or the private from Liverpool, the grand logistical strategy was an invisible god, a distant force they could only pray to. Their world was not the 25,000 tons of supplies projected for D+30. Their world was the weight of the rifle in their hands, the water filling their boots, and the terrifyingly small number of ammunition clips in their web gear. On the beaches, the carefully choreographed ballet of supply immediately descended into a brutal, chaotic scrum. Hobart's funnies, the saviors on paper, met with mixed fates. A DD tank, its canvas screen ripped by shrapnel, would founder in the waves, taking its crew and its desperately needed firepower down into the dark. A Churchill Avra, poised to obliterate a bunker, might hit a Teller mine, its immense flying dustbins silenced forever. On Omaha Beach, the wreckage of burned-out tanks and sinking landing craft created a graveyard of steel before the first wave of infantry had even secured a foothold. The meticulously packed pallets of supplies, food, water, medicine, ammunition, were dumped into the surf, swept away by the tide, or set ablaze by artillery fire. The lifeline, stretched taut across the channel, was being shredded at the point of delivery. The numbers meant nothing if they couldn't get from the boat to the man who needed them, and the men needed them. They needed everything. For Private Frank Tierney of the 29th Infantry Division, the first 48 hours ashore were a blur of terror, exhaustion, and a deep, gnawing hunger that overshadowed even the fear. His D-Day K ration, a wax-coated box containing biscuits, a small tin of processed meat and a fruit bar, had been consumed in the landing craft. A second was lost to the sea when he scrambled from the ramp into the chest-deep water. Pushing inland into the dense, confusing hedgerow country, resupply was a rumor. For 2 days, he and the other survivors of his platoon lived on a shared tin of cold sea ration hash and a handful of sugar cubes meant for coffee they couldn't make. The planners in London had calculated a daily caloric intake necessary for a combat soldier, but Tierney's reality was a hollow ache in his gut, a weakness in his limbs that made the Norman landscape feel like an endless uphill climb. He watched a sergeant, a man he respected, risk his life not to outflank a machine gun, but to crawl to a fallen comrade's pack in the hope of finding a single chocolate D-bar. Hunger became a constant companion, a dull throb that dulled the senses and shortened the temper, reducing the complex calculus of war to the primal need for a single, hot meal. Then came the cold. The Normandy summer was not the idyllic postcard one might imagine. It was a season of relentless rain and a damp, penetrating chill that seeped into a man's bones. In the hastily dug foxholes, which quickly filled with muddy water, soldiers shivered through the nights without blankets or dry clothes. The simple act of removing one's boots became a gamble. Trench foot, a foul condition where the flesh of the feet begins to rot from constant immersion, began to claim victims as surely as German bullets. A soldier from Pennsylvania, huddled in a slit trench with 2 other men, remembered his teeth chattering so violently he was afraid the sound would give away their position. He pressed his body against his comrades, not for comfort, but for a sliver of shared warmth. Sleep was impossible. Misery was total. The great logistical machine was supposed to deliver everything down to dry socks and wool blankets, but these simple comforts were as remote and unobtainable as the moon. The lack of them didn't kill quickly, but it drained away a soldier's will, his health, and his ability to fight, a slow attrition of the human spirit that no statistician could ever quantify. But the most terrifying scarcity was ammunition. In the vicious, close-quarters fighting of the hedgerows, a firefight could burn through a rifleman's entire combat load in minutes. Sergeant Stan Hollis, a British Green Howard, found his platoon pinned down by a German machine gun nest. They had the will to attack, but their pouches were nearly empty. He watched his men one by one check their Bren gun magazines, their faces tight with a unique kind of fear, the fear of being armed but helpless. A soldier with a gun and no bullets is just a target. The bar gunner in an American squad, the linchpin of their firepower, would begin to fire in single shots, conserving his precious 30 caliber rounds, his weapon's fearsome automatic capability rendered useless by the broken supply chain. Runners sent back to the beach would find chaos, disorganized dumps of material, and no one who knew where the 30 caliber belts or the mortar rounds were. The feeling was one of profound and terrifying isolation. You were on your own with what you carried, and when it was gone, it was gone. Men fixed bayonets not for a dramatic charge, but with the grim realization that it might soon be their only remaining weapon. The medics, the docs, faced their own special kind of hell. A medic's value is measured in his ability to alleviate suffering, to patch a man up and give him a chance. But that ability was entirely dependent on his medical kit. PFC, Charlie Grant, a medic with the 101st Airborne, was dropped far from his intended zone. After the first brutal engagements, his supplies were exhausted. He had run out of morphine syrettes, the small disposable injectors that could grant a moment of peace to a horribly wounded man. He knelt beside a young paratrooper whose leg had been shredded by a mine, the boy biting his lip to keep from screaming. Grant had nothing to offer but a useless bandage from his own t-shirt and quiet, hollow words of reassurance. He had no more sulfur powder to prevent infection, no more plasma to combat shock. He was forced to watch men die from wounds that, with the proper supplies, would have been survivable. This was the deepest cost of logistical failure. Not just the loss of fighting strength, but the forced abandonment of the wounded, a moral injury that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. For every grand calculation of fuel and artillery shells, there were 1,000 smaller uncounted needs that defined a soldier's humanity. A man could endure the hunger and the fear, but the lack of a cigarette could push him over the edge. Letters from home, the vital link to a world where people weren't trying to kill you, were lost in transit or sat in soggy mailbags on the beach. Toilet paper, soap, a razor. These were the artifacts of civilization, and their absence was a constant reminder of how far from it they had fallen. A barter economy flourished in the mud. A German Luger pistol, a prized trophy, might be traded for a full pack of cigarettes and a dry pair of socks. A swig of captured Calvados apple brandy was worth more than a day's pay. These small, desperate transactions were a testament to a supply system stretched to its breaking point, where the official channels had failed and men were forced to rely on their own ingenuity and the grim fortunes of war just to feel human for a fleeting moment. The planners had accounted for the needs of an army, but they could not always meet the needs of a man. And in the end, it was men, not divisions, who had to fight and die in the hedgerows of Normandy. This fragile ecosystem of barter and desperation, played out in a million muddy foxholes, was a symptom of a far greater crisis. The entire Normandy lodgement was a starving beast, tethered to the sea by a slender, fraying lifeline. For every man ashore, there were tons of supplies that had to follow, a relentless river of steel, fuel, food, and medicine. But the river was threatening to run dry. The initial plans, so meticulously crafted in the quiet rooms of London, had accounted for fierce German resistance, but they had underestimated the stubborn tyranny of the Norman hedgerows and the sheer grinding friction of war. The advance was slower than hoped, the consumption of ammunition and resources far higher. The beachheads, intended as temporary conduits, were becoming semi-permanent, congested ports, choked with the detritus of battle and the backlog of vital materiel. The artery was hardening. For the men fighting inland, it felt like a slow strangulation. And then on the 19th of June, the weather, which had been a nervous ally on D-Day, turned into a fearsome enemy. The English Channel, the great moat that had protected Britain, now rose up in fury against the forces that had dared to cross it. A storm, the likes of which had not been seen in over 40 years, descended upon the Normandy coast. It was not a battle of men and machines, but a primal assault of wind and water. The wind howled with a biblical fury, whipping the sea into mountainous grey waves that clawed at the shore. For 3 days, the storm raged, halting all unloading. The great artificial harbours, the mulberries, the supposed triumphs of engineering that were to guarantee the Allied supply chain, were battered into submission. At Arromanches, the British mulberry, codenamed Port Winston, groaned and buckled but miraculously held. It was a testament to its more sheltered location and robust design, but at Omaha Beach, the American mulberry was annihilated. Concrete caissons weighing thousands of tons were tossed about like children's blocks. Whole sections of floating roadway were torn from their moorings and twisted into unrecognizable tangles of steel. Hundreds of landing craft, ducks and other vessels were smashed against the shore or sunk beneath the waves, their precious cargoes lost to the churning sea. It was a catastrophe on a scale that threatened the entire invasion. The Germans, hunkered down in their defenses, could not have inflicted a more devastating blow. For a few terrifying days, the Allied army in France was cut off, an island in a hostile land, with dwindling ammunition, fuel, and food. The Great Plan was on the verge of total collapse, not from a German panzer division, but from an act of God. This was the turning point, the unseen climax of the logistical war. It was here that victory was snatched from the jaws of a calamitous, weather-beaten defeat. The planner's masterpiece, the Mulberry Harbour, was broken, and in its place rose a far more primitive but brutally effective solution born of desperation and sheer grit. The focus shifted back to the beaches themselves. The big ships, the LST's landing ship tank, were ordered to do what they were designed for, but what everyone had hoped to avoid on such a massive, continuous scale. They drove their flat-bottomed hulls directly onto the sand, grounding themselves at high tide, opening their giant bow doors like the mouths of hungry whales. As the tide receded, they sat high and dry on the beach, and columns of trucks drove straight out of their holds and onto the soil of France. They became the bridge. Engineers and Seabees worked around the clock, in churning surf and under sporadic shellfire, clearing wreckage, building causeways, and directing the endless traffic. It was ugly, inefficient, and dangerous, but it worked. The river of supplies, once choked to a trickle, began to flow again, first as a stream, then as a torrent. With the supply lines re-established and fortified, the balance of power in Normandy shifted irrevocably. The beast was fed. In late July, Operation Cobra was launched. Thousands of bombers laid a carpet of explosives on the German lines near Saint-Lô, and through the dust and fire poured the American armored divisions, their tanks full of fuel, their guns supplied with an almost limitless quantity of shells. The German defenses, bled white and starved of reinforcements and supplies, finally shattered. The breakout was on. The slow, bloody knife fight in the hedgerows gave way to a war of movement, a race across France. And it was all made possible by the men who had triumphed over the storm, the unsung quartermasters and engineers who had resurrected the supply chain from the wreckage on the beaches. Long after the last shell fell silent and the armies moved on, the scars of this immense undertaking remained etched upon the land. The earth itself remembers. For decades, the farmers of Normandy would conduct the iron harvest, their plows turning up not just potatoes and stones, but the rusted, jagged teeth of war, shell fragments, spent cartridges, belt buckles, and the skeletal remains of forgotten equipment. The hedgerows, once ancient markers of property and peace, were torn and mangled, forever changed by the passage of tanks. Along the coast, the colossal concrete blocks of the German Atlantic Wall still slump into the sand, monuments to a defeated empire, their gun embrasures staring out at a placid sea like the vacant eyes of skulls. And offshore, for years, the ghostly ruins of the American Mulberry were visible at low tide, a grim reminder of nature's power and the fragility of human enterprise. These are the visible wounds, but there are deeper ones too. The silence that now hangs over the American cemetery at Colleville-sur-Mer is heavier than any sound. The perfect rows of white crosses and stars of David mark not just the cost of victory, but the final, personal failure of the supply chain for each man buried there. For them, the plasma, the ammunition, the reinforcement did not arrive in time. The logistics of war are ultimately a race against death, and for the nearly 10,000 souls resting in that soil, it was a race that was lost. The quiet dignity of the place stands in stark contrast to the chaotic, deafening violence that put them there. It is a silence that speaks of the immense industrial and human effort that carried the survivors forward, an effort built upon the bodies of the fallen. In the end, the story of D-Day's logistics is a profound paradox. It was an act of creation on a scale the world had never seen, all in the service of destruction. It was the mobilization of the most advanced industrial society on Earth to engage in the most primitive of human activities, organized killing. The invasion's success was a victory of the assembly line, the spreadsheet, and the cargo manifest as much as it was a victory of the rifle and the bayonet. It proved that a war is not won simply by the courage of its soldiers, but by a nation's ability to sustain them, to reach across an ocean and place into a young man's hand everything he needs, not just to fight, but to endure. The tide still comes in twice a day at Omaha Beach, washing the sand clean, erasing the footprints of tourists and slowly, grain by grain, wearing away the monuments of war. It is a rhythm of forgetting and remembering, and it reminds us that history is not just a story of great men and decisive battles, but of the mountains of material they must move, and the deep, indelible marks they leave upon the world.